Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the second day of our Marine Mammal Commission annual meeting. For those who weren't here yesterday, I'm Peter Thomas, Executive Director of the Marine Mammal Commission. And I wanted to point out that today is the International Day for Biological Diversity. So Samantha Strindberg here from the Wildlife Conservation Society rightfully pointed out that we should be taking a moment to think about biodiversity. There's a report released about 2 weeks ago now on the catastrophic loss of biodiversity around the world. So if you haven't seen that report, it's worth going to look that report up and see what the findings are. And it's often interesting as you meet in a local area we talk about local issues, local populations, and to remember that the trends, the things we see in one area, whether they're up or neutral or down, are part of the biodiversity of the globe. And when you start to add things up, sometimes the whole picture is going up or going down. So we often think we're fine locally, but we do need to think globally about what's happening with biodiversity. So a moment for biological diversity around the world. Yesterday was a great day. We had fantastic talks on spinner dolphins, and what was the other one? Monk seals. Yeah, took me a second. And we really appreciate the speakers and the incredible preparation for that yesterday, and again, the diligence that went into preparing for those sessions as well. And today we have another set of sessions on odontocetes in the morning and humpback whales in the afternoon. Just a few, I think people know the housekeeping. I don't know how many of you are here for the first time, but the exits are there, and there. If there's a fire, you go out and gather in the parking lot, and the restrooms are around the corner, going out that door, way around the corner, actually quite a bit farther away than I expected. I just encourage, we have the Marine Mammal Commissioners at the front table and the Committee of Scientific Advisors and staff, and I'd encourage you during the discussions, if you want to talk, go like this, but also put your sign vertically, because that'll be a good reminder for the moderator to check in the audience. And what we've been doing is, after presentations, asking for the commissioners, the scientific advisors, to come up, raise any questions or comments first, and then as time goes on, move to the audience and the more general public. And the other reminder is that we're here to get information, to hear about the situation in the Hawaiian Islands. It's not really a place for testimony, as this is not like a formal hearing where we're taken on board, but we really appreciate your comments because those help us think about the issues. So as you make comments, think about that way. We're all here in a really friendly space and really looking forward to what you have to say. So moving on today to this morning's session, it's on odontocete fisheries interactions. And just to give you a little background, I think many of you are extremely familiar with the issue, but basically there are several species and populations of Hawaiian odontocetes, that is toothed whales, which are known to interact with hook and line fisheries, such as those using long line, short line, hand line, and trolling gear. The most sort of prominent interactions we know about are those between the pelagic population of Hawaiian false killer whales and the deep-set long-line fishery, and that will be the subject of the first session this morning. And that fishery, which is based in Honolulu, operates in international waters and within the EEZ to within about 50 nautical miles of the main Hawaiian Islands. And then there's a false killer whale take reduction team, which is focused on mitigation of the harmful interactions between fisheries and false killer whales. And it's complicated because false killer whales regularly depredate bait and and in doing so catch the long line hooks and are sometimes hooked themselves. And this more often than not can result in serious injury or occasionally death of the false killer whales. And so in the second session, we'll talk about a number of odontocetes species in the more nearshore environment, including the endangered insular population of false killer whales, which occurs close to the islands and also has the potential to interact with nearshore state-managed commercial and recreational fisheries. I won't give you much more detail than that because we'll get it during the sessions. But so our first session, we'll focus on pelagic false killer whales and focus on understanding the factors that influence the interactions between the whales and longline gear, recent changes in the patterns of interaction, the importance of obviously the importance of these interactions to the killer whale population itself, the performance of current mitigation measures, and new mitigation measures being considered by the false killer whale take reduction team. And then we'll have a little bit of discussion of the process of the difficulties and the factors leading to the difficulty of reaching consensus on a package of mitigation measures, and kind of where all the parties are looking now and where they may go on this. So our first presenters are very familiar to us now. And so I'd ask Aaron Olson, lead scientist of the Cetacean Research Program from the NIMS Pacific Island Fisheries Science Center, to introduce us to this. Thanks, Aaron. Oh, now I have to do this. Second. There we go. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good morning. Okay, so I'm going to start us off, as Peter said, talking about primarily the Hawaii pelagic stock of false killer whales. A little bit of background about what we know of their population biology, the stock status, and some of the research that's been ongoing both within the Science Center and among a number of other researchers, Robin at Cascadia and a number of others, to try to understand the mechanism of interactions between the whales and the fishery. So just briefly, there are 3 populations of false killer whales in the Hawaiian archipelago. The endangered main Hawaiian Islands insular stock current abundance is around 150 animals. Range is restricted to the main Hawaiian Islands, is shown in red on this map. And that's about all I'm going to say about it for the course of this session. That stock is largely protected from the longline fishery by the expanded longline exclusion zone that was implemented as part of the take reduction plan. So in terms of fisheries interactions with the longline fleet, there's low probability of those. The Northwest Hawaiian Islands stock is shown in green. It's the most uncertain in terms of what we know of abundance and distribution, habitat associations otherwise. But current abundance is around 550 animals and range restricted to primarily the Papahanao-Mokuakea Marine National Monument, but extended east to include waters around Kauai, and with a little bit of an offshore extension because of some satellite tagging that showed animals moving offshore. So primarily for today, we're going to be talking about the pelagic stock. Its boundary on this map is shown as the EEZ. However, we know well that it extends beyond the EEZ boundary. The stock boundary currently limits the inshore distribution of the stock to within 11 kilometers of the main Hawaiian Islands. That's based entirely on telemetry and sighting data. And the current abundance from the 2010 survey is about 1,550 animals. And I say high fisheries bycatch in quotes because while the bycatch does exceed PBR and has been consistently high for many decades, it is still relatively rare, and that really complicates our ability to find patterns and mechanisms for reducing it. So just a quick what we know about pelagic false killer whale distribution, other than sighting data from surveys, which are primarily within the EEZ, our best assessment of the range and distribution patterns of this stock come from the telemetry data. There are 6 tags deployed on the pelagic stock at this point, each of them shown in a different color here. And these were deployed between 2013 and 2017. And essentially showing, very broad-ranging One of the tags there in white was deployed by Robin and his staff off of the Big Island, and you can see that animal ranged quite far to the east. So one of the things that makes false killer whales so tricky is their sort of unique foraging behavior, at least compared to the other pelagic delphinids that are in our region. They hunt in these dispersed subgroups, and they're primarily foraging on large pelagic fish, therefore directly overlapping with and competing with the longline fishery for their target, for their prey and the longline fishery's target catch. And they also frequently share prey, so one animal will catch the fish and then it will get passed around among the other animals in the group, each of them taking a bite off and passing it on to the next. So this really helps likely solidify their social structure and their bonds within the group. And also because both the forage fish and the population is rather dispersed and patchy, this dispersed subgroups lets them sort of search a broader area and then come together when they find fish. So these are observations of false killer whale prey, taking large pelagic fish prey. These photos are all from the insular stock, but with the exception of threadfin jack, are all known to be taken in the longline fishery as well, based on the depredation reports from the observer data. In addition to what is shown here, we also know that they forage on big eye tuna, the primary catch of the longline fishery. So one of the primary approaches for us to be able to evaluate the impact of the fishery is using these large-scale surveys. And so the Hawaiian Islands Cetacean and Ecosystem Assessment Survey began in 2002 from the Southwest Fisheries Science Center. Excuse me. And I will note that it was actually decades of what was thought to be unsustainably high levels of bycatch in the longline fishery that prompted this initial survey to be conducted by the Southwest Center. Since then, there have been 2 additional surveys in 2010 and 2017, and these are providing the primary abundance data for pelagic false killer whales. The group size estimation approach has changed with each survey, and that's as we've learned more about false killer whale social structure and how they distribute themselves in the environment. We've had to modify our data collection techniques in order to make our estimates more robust and more precise. And I'll go a little bit into why that is such a problem for us. So in theory, line transect data conform to this sort of design where you see a group of animals that are all nicely clustered together, and you measure the distance to the center of that group, and you aggregate all of those distances together, and you follow the relatively straightforward formula, and you calculate abundance. So the problem is that so in this situation here, group A would actually technically be considered outside of the search area because the center of the group is outside of the strip width, the range at which the observers can reliably detect animals. And group B would be within. And the analytical framework accounts for all of this for us. We don't have to make these judgments in the field. So in reality, false killer whale groups look something like this. So as we're transiting along the track line, we come across maybe that first group sort of in the center there. And the standard approach would be that we would turn the ship towards that group and estimate group size in the process. So by doing so, we've now prevented ourselves from seeing the rest of these subgroups and potentially changed the whale behavior in a way that biases both our encounter rate and our group size estimates. So we've had to change both our approach to estimating group size and our approach to determining the encounter rate. So Southwest Fisheries Science Center developed all these, what is now really the standard for how we do abundance surveys in the Pacific, and this is largely worldwide how this is done, but as you find a group, you close on the sighting, meaning you turn towards it, you count the number of animals in the group, and then you move on. That was how data were collected here in the Pacific up through 2009. In 2010, as towed array acoustics were introduced to the surveys, it became evident that this sort of spread out subgroup structure in false killer whales was also going on, it was evident in the towed array data, and that we needed a different approach. So closing on the group and counting the animals is going to underestimate group size because we're only seeing 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 subgroups. So in 2010, we implemented a new group size estimation protocol where when the first subgroup was detected, we would turn off the track line and then use the acoustic or visual data to essentially continue driving through the center of the various subgroups in order to better account for the total subgroup, the total group size in the area. Well, it turns out that can go on for a really long time. And you could be driving for 20 miles before you've counted all the subgroups. And by that point, you are way outside of your survey strip. So that approach overestimates encounter rate. So learn by doing. We've now, again, altered our group size estimation approach, and it's now 2 phases. So the first phase is essentially passing mode, which allow us to collect the data we need to estimate encounter rate. So in this case, we're staying on the track line and just continuing to both visually and acoustically keep track of the subgroups that we're finding. And then once we've passed completely through the group, which again could go on for hours, we turn around and start to close on individual subgroups and collect subgroup size estimates. We don't try to associate individual encounters from the first phase with subgroup sizes from the second phase. That's just not feasible. And so we treat those 2 parts separately in the estimation. So this is a pretty nice representation of what it looks like in the field using our current approach. So in this case, the ship is traveling from right to left. And as it starts passing through the groups, the acoustics team is detecting subgroups and plotting bearings to those subgroups. In this case, they detected 19 different subgroups of pelagic false killer whales. The visual team observed 18 of those, and this proceeded for 19.3 nautical miles. By the time we turn around and go back and estimate subgroup size for some of these, and then do more interesting things like deploy tags or collect biopsy samples, this could pretty much take all day. So all of that was just set up to give some background into why it's quite difficult for us to compare the abundance estimates that arise from the 3 different surveys. The details in this table of how each component of the density equation is being calculated are not really what's important. The main part here is that the differences in both encounter rate, or N, and the subgroup size has changed over time, and that makes it quite difficult for us to combine the data in a way that we could actually estimate trend for this population. We are taking a lot of the advances that have come about since 2002 to go back and recalculate abundance and density for the 2002 and 2010 surveys. So we will have, at least for all of the parameters that can be consistent, we are implementing that, and we expect those new abundance estimates for all 3 years to be available later this summer. So, as I just said, what about these 3 estimates? So variation in data collection and analysis methods means that the estimates aren't directly comparable. And then that's not because we are trying to avoid estimating trend. It is because we are trying to adapt and improve the abundance estimate, creating a more robust and more precise estimate with each survey. But of course, there are some limitations just in general, independent of the changes in group size estimation approach. There are very low encounter rates. In the 2002 survey, there was 1 group of false killer whales observed in the EEZ, and even during the 2010 survey, there were 5. That leads to high variance, and the estimates, it also means that between survey years, the estimates are likely to overlap and be fairly imprecise. And then there's also just these sort of artificial constraints that we survey and manage using the EEZ as a boundary. And it's a jurisdictional boundary, not a biological boundary, but it's still the boundary of our survey area, and so that means our abundance estimates are constrained to that area and don't really represent the full population abundance. And so changes in abundance within that area don't really reflect, or may not reflect, changes in population status. So with that, this is sort of a very brief summary then of the sort of history of pelagic false killer whale assessment. Along the x-axis is the SAR year, and these represent the 5-year mortality and serious injury rates from the longline fishery within that SAR year. So 2010 SAR year has data from up through 2008. We are tracking mortality and serious injury inside the EZ in blue and outside the EZ in orange, and then relative to the PBR, which is the red dots. And so you can see in the early years after the 2002 survey, the PBR was quite low, but the abundance estimates were very low as well. That initiated the take reduction team, which convened in 2010, but the take reduction plan was effective starting in 2012, and that's what we've been working with since. So starting in SAR year 2016, the inside the EEZ mortality and serious injury rate did drop below PBR. The stock is currently considered not strategic. However, the bycatch rates continue to increase outside the EEZ. And in 2018 and 19, the SEZ, the Southern Exclusion Zone, which Ann will introduce and discuss in much more detail, has been closed because of take rates inside the EZ. So the situation is quite dynamic, and it's really difficult to say right now what the stock status is. So with that discussion of the TRP, I'm going to transition a little bit to some of the science that has been ongoing in order to help us address how do we reduce interaction rates. When the take reduction team convened in 2010, it quickly became evident that reducing bycatch just as a concept was going to be quite difficult. It's really driven by depredation. The animals are taking catch off of the gear, and in the process of that, occasionally getting hooked. And so to reduce bycatch really was going to mean having to reduce depredation. And false killer whales interact with and depredate fisheries way beyond Hawaii. And many people have been working on this for a long time, and most attempts to develop some sort of, trick mechanism to keep them off of the gear haven't been successful for very long. So we've been more focused now on the take reduction plan itself focuses primarily on reducing the serious injury rate as a way of getting the bycatch rate below PBR, but much of the research has still focused on how to reduce depredation or avoid interactions in the first place. So as part of the initial take reduction team analysis, we went quite deeply into the observer program data, both just observation, like looking at the observations themselves, and doing some habitat and other types of modeling. And unfortunately, not much that could direct the team towards an answer came from that. But this is mostly what was learned. So this was led by Karen Forney. So the map there shows marine mammal damaged fish, so this would be a depredation, and then color-coded gray is 0 and dark pink or red is quite high, and sort of the spatial distribution of that. So there are a few hot spots of depredation throughout the EZ. This was over 2003 to 2008. Depredation and bycatch are linked, but not linearly, so on this plot are the blue dots are the bycatch locations, so it's not a one-for-one relationship. The only significant variable to come out of the analysis was that the more hooks you put in the water, the higher the likelihood of bycatch. So that's quite a difficult measure to reduce. Without reducing fishing, if that's all you've got to work with, we've got some issues, which is true. And then the distribution of target fish catch isn't a strong indicator for depredation and bycatch as well, and that's largely because they are foraging and taking fish across the mahi-mahi and ono and all of the different fish that the fishery retains and targets. So one of the projects that was started quite early on was to deploy acoustic recorders on the longline gear, and this was really designed to assess vessel and gear sounds, so is there some sort of an acoustic cue, and also the rate of false killer whale occurrence around the gear, their behavior around the gear, and then again identifying whether there are cues. And this was a partnership between the Hawaii Longline Association, HLA, and the Observer Program. It started in 2011, I believe, and it's still ongoing. We had quite a long period of working with a couple of individual captains, sort of really dialing in how do you connect an acoustic recorder to fishing gear without altering the fishing gear itself and creating problems for the crew. Once that was sort of well determined, then we chartered a number of fishing vessels and had them deploy several recorders throughout the gear. This was aimed at trying to understand how animals might move around in the gear. And now we're in a phase of voluntary deployments where we work directly with the Observer Program. They let us know which boats are going to be given an observer in the next day or two, and we reach out to them, those boats directly, and ask them if they would like to participate. At this rate, we're monitoring about 1 to 2 boats per month. So the acoustic recorder that we're using at the time was fairly innovative. Now we're ready to start thinking about how to make it smaller and a little bit easier for the fishermen to deploy. But the specific design considerations were that we needed to be sampling broadband, capturing the full range of false killer whale vocalizations, wanted to be able to monitor the full fishing trip, and then it had to be lightweight and small, that they can pick it up, put it on the gear, throw it over the rail, and not have to stop their operations. It has a saltwater switch, so we don't have any at-sea programming or interaction. They just throw it in and pull it out. And fishing gear is quite dynamic, so trying to isolate the acoustic recordings from that noise. And so what we learned, so this is, the results I'm showing here are from the set of trips that we chartered. It was 6 trips, which represented a total of about 90 fishing sets, where we deployed up to 5 recorders throughout the gear. So this is false killer whale detections acoustically in relation to the fishing phase. So setting the gear takes several hours, then the gear soaks for several hours, and then the gear begins to haul. So what became quickly evident is false killer whale detections were peak during the haul. So in this plot, the blue bars are detections that are only for echolocation clicks, the orange are whistles, and the gray are both. And those are distinguished in that, a detection that might consist only of whistles, may not represent animals foraging on the gear, maybe just in the vicinity. We can't tease that apart from the acoustics alone. But this peak at the beginning of the haul was intriguing, and whether suggested that maybe that the animals are approaching during the haul. So we looked at this a little bit further by looking at those sets where we had multiple recorders deployed within the set. There are 3 of them where we have multiple detections, and I'm just going to orient you to the plot before I go through all 3. So in this case, the gear is set from the bottom to the top, and then it's hauled in reverse. So the boat moves down along the y-axis as it's hauling gear. And then along the top axis is the soak duration and the haul duration, and where 0 is this transition from when the boat starts hauling their gear. So in this case, there were 3 recorders deployed, and the false killer whales began to be detected about an hour before the gear was hauled. That detection at that instrument lasted for almost 2 hours, and then false killer whales were detected right at the beginning of the haul on the recorder that was further away from the vessel, and continued to be detected until that instrument was retrieved back onto the boat. So there are 2 other cases of this from the data set. The one on the upper left is one of the more interesting. The stars on the y-axis represent baskets or locations within the gear where the observer recorded depredation. So essentially depredation throughout the whole set. And in this case, false killer whales were heard on the gear about 4 hours before the haul began, and sequentially we're moving up the gear closer to the boat until the haul started, and then farther away from the boat as the vessel started moving back down the gear, pulling those gear in. And the last detection ends not long before the boat picks up that acoustic recorder. And then similar pattern on our 3rd set there. So this was suggesting that the false killer whales are remaining among the gear for quite a long time. We don't know that this is exactly the same group of animals. It could be different subgroups at different times, but nonetheless around the gear for a long time, and that they might be following the haul, that they're kind of staying away from the boat at some distance, and then at some point they peel off. False killer whales are fairly rarely sighted by observers or captains and crews during the haul. Of course, it is happening primarily at night, but they're around the gear much more often than is being reported in the observer data. And then in the overall average observer program data set, the average depredation rate is about 6%. Within our study, it was around 5% reported from the observer data. However, there was 13% of the time that false killer whales were near the gear, according to the acoustic data. So they're depredating or near the gear at a much higher rate than is suggested by the observer data. And this led us to think that maybe they are also depredating on bait, which isn't well recorded in the observer data because it's quite hard to distinguish what the cause of an empty hook is. Did the bait just fall off? Did a fish take it? Or was it depredated? And in working with Aaron Thode, he was developing a camera system for looking at depredation by sperm whales in Alaska and adapted the camera to deploy in the longline fishery, and maybe it will play. If it doesn't, it's just fun. It's not, we'll pass it for now. It can come back later if you're interested. Essentially, quite stark proof that they are depredating bait. Okay, and the last little bit I want to talk about here is some insights from tagged false killer whales. This has been led by Robin and Dave Anderson. And they looked at the locations of tagged pelagic animals in relation to fishing sets from the logbook data. And they found about 10% of the tagged animal locations were within 100 kilometers of a set, and 26 sets with 3 or more whale positions within 100 kilometers. So there is a fairly small fraction of the time, within at least of these few, at that time 3, tagged pelagic false killer whales that were within 100 kilometers of logbook data set. And of these, only 6 sets had evidence of interactions, and I'll zoom in on that a bit here. So this is the first one. It's 3 consecutive sets. There's no observer on board, and the black dots are the tag locations and the distance of those relative to the fishing gear. So the initial tag locations are more than 100 kilometers from the gear during the set, and then similarly during the soak, and then once the vessel starts hauling gear, there's this very rapid approach from more than 100 kilometers away to the animals being practically on top of the fishing gear. The catch on these sets was greater than on the preceding sets and the subsequent sets, so whether the false killer whales knew this was a great set or not, or just got lucky, we don't really have any good way of assessing that. And then in this case, the sets overlap spatially. So the captain chose not to move despite the depredation. Karen Forney did look into this as part of the TRT and found that if a vessel moves more than 100 kilometers, they can reduce their rate of depredation, but that's a big ask for a fishing boat in some cases. And I'm going to skip this one. It's essentially the same thing, but that animals stayed near the gear over the course of 3 separate sets. The vessel captain did move between sets 2 and 3, but looks like the whales essentially followed them. The distance between the tagged whales and the gear stays pretty small. So, in conclusion, false killer whales are smarter than we are. They are smarter than me. They seem to be smarter than the fishermen, and they are outsmarting a number of people who have put a lot of effort into trying to reduce the catch and depredation on their gear. So depredation and bycatch continue to be a problem. As I said earlier, in 2018 and 19, the southern exclusion zone was closed because of 2 takes inside the EZ, and Ann will talk a lot more about that. And we've primarily been focusing on developing new analytical and processing approaches for examining the high seas, the large-scale survey, visual and passive acoustic data sets to see what we can mine from there about false killer whale behavior over the course of our monitoring period, which is several hours. And also working on habitat-based density estimates for the fishery area. So this is an example of that, where we use the survey data from the EEZ as well as survey data from Palmyra and the ETP and the West Coast to parameterize, essentially develop what are the environmental correlates with false killer whale density, and then use that to help guide our evaluation of what the EEZ estimates really mean. Are they when they change annually, is that really changes in abundance, or is that changes in distribution? So with that, I will stop.
So as we change presentations, any questions, quick questions to clarify or information from Aaron?
I have a question on the, so there's 6 trips that were
Please identify yourself.
sorry.
And I had a question.
Microphone.
Sorry, we're going to go a little bit in order of Francis.
Oh.
You had a question?
Sorry. Just might have missed it, but the takes, were they based on the observer data of a mortality, or was it a serious injury interpretation from photographs of...
Right. Yes, thank you. I didn't actually say that. So in these, the takes that I showed in that one plot, that's based on observed either dead animals or animals that were, hooked in a way that was consistent with the serious injury criteria that we use in NIMS. So more often than not, that means hooked through the mouth, hooked in the mouth, and or with a significant amount of trailing gear that could cause entanglement or other things.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Randy, and don't worry, I will get back to you. I apologize for cutting you off. Yeah. So Randy?
Yeah, Aaron, when you speak of the fishery, I'm just wondering if that's a U.S. fishery only when you're talking about it, and you're saying yes. So when you were, it looked like a lot of the time that one animal especially that tagged was outside the U.S. EEZ. Clearly they spend a lot of time out there, this population or part of the population. And I assume there are other countries fishing outside, not inside, but outside the U.S. EEZ, is that the way it works?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, do you get any, then the estimates of MSI outside the EEZ, you have a lot of data on that, but that comes from the observer program of U.S. fishermen outside the U.S. zone, or from other
So
fisheries?
the U.S. fleet is, or the Hawaii-based fishery is observed at 20%, independent of where they're fishing, so inside or outside the EEZ. And then foreign fleets are observed as part of their obligations in the WCPFC, the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission. I think we have other people in the audience that can speak much more knowledgeably about that than I can, but there are bycatch information from that. We have in the past looked at trying to develop some rough estimates of overall bycatch rates. It is at least several times higher than the U.S. bycatch rate, but I can't give a definitive order of magnitude at this point.
Okay. Aaron, and we'll take yours and then yours, and then we'll move on, and we can have more time after. But go ahead, Aaron.
Thank you. So looking at your data, it looks pretty convincing that the animals can detect the presence of the vessels from 100 kilometers away. Do you see any distinctive acoustic cues when the vessel begins to haul, or you have some idea what sort of acoustic cues may alert the animals of a haul versus a simple transit?
Yeah, we're just starting to look into that now. So some of our early deployments, we had some issues with noise in the recorders that were sort of confounding, whether that is that really a vessel noise or is that something else. So now we have a couple of years worth of really nice quality recordings, and I have a new staff member working on going through those and looking exactly for consistent cues, and then comparing those with the observer program data to try to understand where those might be coming from.
Thanks. Now to you, who I cut off again. I apologize. Go ahead and grab the mic.
How's it? I just had a question. You said about the 6 chartered trips. My question was on that, was there a set minimum on that? And was the intention to actually have interaction? And was there, I guess, how many sets were there on each one of those trips? And what were the parameters of where they had to fish?
So we did not require them to, we essentially allowed them to fish as they normally would. So it was a standard fishing trip. The only requirement that we placed was that they weren't allowed to split their set, because we were trying to look at how animals were moving among the gear. Sometimes fishermen will set their total longline gear in 2 or more separate pieces. So we didn't allow them to split the set. But other than that, they kept their catch. They were allowed to fish wherever they wanted, and it was a standard fishing trip. Yeah.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Aaron. So Anne, oh, I tried to do this. Okay. So, again, introducing Ann Garrett, Assistant Regional Administrator for Protected Resources Division from the NIMS Pacific Islands Regional Office, who will talk about the false killer whale take reduction plan status. Thanks for coming again.
Thanks for having me. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Aaron, for providing that background on false killer whales. So NIMS and the take reduction team published the false killer whale take reduction plan in 2012. The purpose of the take reduction plan is to reduce serious injury and mortality of the Hawaii pelagic insular stocks, Hawaii pelagic and insular stocks of false killer whales in the Hawaii longline fisheries. The goals of the plan are, number one is a short-term goal to reduce within 6 months of the plan, the plan's implementation, the incidental mortality and serious injury in the Hawaii pelagic and insular stocks to less than the stock's PBR. And then the long-term goal is to reduce within 5 years of the plan's implementation the incidental mortality and serious injury of both those stocks to insignificant levels approaching zero, that is, less than 10% of PBR. Incidental mortality and serious injury of the high seas component of the Hawaii pelagic stock does not increase. At the time of the final rule, that was 11.2 false killer whales per year. The plan reached its 5 years just recently and has not met these goals. The plan as it was designed included regulatory measures, 2 gear requirements for deep set longline fishery, weak circle hooks and strong branch lines. And the intent of that was to straighten the hooks when a false killer whale was hooked. The plan also included a longline fishing prohibited area around the islands. And the southern exclusion zone, which would be closed to deep set longlining if within a single calendar year there was an observed mortality and serious injury of 2 animals, or when expanded for observer coverage exceeded the stock's PBR. The plan also included 4 measures to improve captain and crew response to hooked or entangled marine mammals. The first was that all captains would be trained in marine mammal handling and release through the Protected Species Workshop that National Marine Fisheries Service offers. The captain must also supervise any marine mammal interactions, and there must be a posting of a placard with handling and release guidelines on the vessel, and a posting of placard instructions instructing crew to notify the captain when an interaction occurred. In 2019, we had 4 false killer whales and 1 blackfish interaction within the deep set fishery. 2 were inside the EEZ and 2 outside the EEZ. The 2 inside the EEZ, 1 was a clear mortality and 1 was a serious injury. These 2 inside the EEZ met the trigger for a southern exclusion zone closure. This was in 2019, this was the second of such closures, and that southern exclusion zone was closed in February. In 2018, the first closure of the southern exclusion zone occurred since the implementation of the plan, where we had 13 false killer whale interactions and 1 blackfish interaction. All were in the deep set fishery. 9 of the false killer whales and 1 blackfish occurred outside the EEZ, and 4 inside the EEZ. All of the 4 inside the EEZ were considered serious injuries, and those were the ones that triggered the closure. In 2018, the closure occurred in July, and was the southern exclusion zone was closed through the end of the calendar year. Because the 2019 closure was the second consecutive year that the SEZ was been closed, the SEZ will remain closed until it's opened by NIMS per the criteria specified in the plan. The plan regulations says that the SEZ will remain closed at least till the end of the current calendar year. If the SEZ, the plan detailed that if the SEZ was closed in the previous year, NIMS would reopen the SEZ if one or more of the following criteria were met. Number one is NIMS determines upon consideration of the TRT's recommendations and evaluation of all relevant circumstances that opening the SEZ is warranted. Number two, in the 2-year period immediately following the closure, the deep set fishery has 0 observed false killer whale MSI within the remaining open areas of the EEZ around Hawaii. In the 2nd year period immediately following the closure, number 3, the deep set fishery has reduced its total rate of false killer whale MSI, including the EEZ around Hawaii, the high seas, and the EEZ around the territories and Johnson Atoll, but not Palmyra Atoll, by an amount equal to or greater than the rate that would be required to reduce the false killer whale incidental mortality and serious injury within the EEZ around Hawaii to below the Hawaii pelagic false killer whale stocks PBR. And number 4, the average estimated level of false killer whale MSI in the deep set longline fishery within the remaining open areas of the EEZ around Hawaii for up to the 5 most recent years is below PBR for the Hawaii pelagic stock of false killer whales. Between 2013 and 2018, the number of total interactions for both the shallow set and deep set was 50. In the deep set, outside the EEZ in 2018, estimated 10, and inside we had 4. As you can see from these numbers, 2017 was the first time that we actually closed the plan, or closed the SEZ area since the plan was implemented. And the shallow set has had very few interactions, observed interactions, since the implementation of the plan. Taking a hard look at the type of interactions and the success of the plan, we evaluated the success of straightening the hook and then the way that these interactions were handled on a vessel. Out of the total from 2013 to 2018, the vast majority of the time, the line was either cut or broke. Very few times did we have a hook straightened. 4 times out of all these interactions, a hook was straightened. 1 time a hook broke. 6 times the animal came free of the gear. And then we had 3 mortalities. So this is very telling about the intent to straighten a hook is not quite working as intended. During the same period, a total of 33 serious injuries and 10 non-serious injuries. 3 cannot be determined, and 3 mortalities on the fisheries. So between 2013 and 2018, 49 interactions in the deep set and 1 in the shallow set. 39 were outside the EEZ and 10 inside the EEZ. In 2018, 10 were outside the EEZ and 4 inside the EEZ. In 2019, 5 interactions, including 1 blackfish, and 2 inside the EEZ. Both were mortalities and serious injuries. So the outcome, 39% of the interactions, the line was cut, line broke during 29%, and 73% of the interactions resulted in mortality and serious injury. 2018, as I mentioned, and 2019 were the only years that the southern exclusion zone has been triggered. Last year, April 2018, prior to the southern exclusion zone being closed for the first time, the team evaluated the status of the plan and the status of the false killer whale interactions, determined that the plan is not meeting all of the goals and objectives, and the team began drafting recommendations to amend the plan at that April meeting. This team has worked very diligently to try to continue to come up with consensus recommendations, had a number of meetings, which is unusual for many TRTs. They've continued to have regular calls instead of just an annual meeting. The current recommendations under consideration by the team include gear modifications. So we're looking at changing the diameter of the hook potentially and the diameter of the branch line. Modifications to the EEZ have been discussed, including potentially removing the SEZ if certain gear modifications are made. And then significant dialogue has pursued on the handling and training, recognizing that since the operations have not been executed as intended, that may be a significant part of what we need to be doing. Oftentimes in our review, the captain actually is not on the deck and working with the crew when an animal is hooked. So we've talked a lot about how we would revise training, including making sure that we overcome cultural and language barriers. Last but not least, electronic monitoring has also been discussed to help us better understand the type of interactions that are occurring. Oh, excuse me, one more. Move-on guidelines also have been discussed, and the vessels, if they have an interaction, may have to move on to a specified distance. And that is it for my presentation, so I can take questions at this time.
Okay, questions for Ann? Oh, Jason, please.
Thanks, Ann. I'm curious, given that the plan that was put in place didn't have the desired, didn't achieve the desired mitigation, and the list of recommendations that you just went through, I don't find it too compelling that those will result in the desired mitigation. So maybe I just don't understand it, but if maybe go through those and explain if people have diagnosed what was not working and why, and how these new modifications would address them. And specifically with regard to the hooks, I remember that it's not so much the diameter of the hook, but the actual strength of the hook, which can vary a great deal with a given diameter. Is that being addressed in the new recommendations?
Yeah, I'll start with the last one first. You're absolutely right. It's the strength of the hook that is the concern. And it might be actually better your first question to ask the entire panel, because a lot of them have dialogued over it quite a bit and have their opinions. I think importantly, because we're not even seeing the type of line straightening and behavior that we expected from the crew and the captain when an animal is hooked, that is a significant part of what NMFS has been looking at, and potentially and recognizes that we need to definitely take a different approach on training and We've talked at length about the training should not be limited to both the team and internal to NIMS. We've talked at length about the training probably should not be limited to the captains because they're simply not always the ones on deck and dealing with the issue.
Patty?
Yes, thank you. It looks like in at least recent years, the takes have gone up outside the EEZ and either stayed steady or gone down inside the EEZ. Is there any reason, are the fishing practices different inside and outside the EEZ that would cause higher takes outside than inside?
That is a great question. That might be a better question for the panel to dialogue over because I think there's a number of opinions on that. It's absolutely true. It does appear, as Aaron said, that they're increasing outside the EEZ. We've tried to take a look at why that might be happening, but I think that's actually part of the motivation for having electronic monitoring because we may be missing quite a big picture, missing the big picture. And I don't know if anybody wants to add to that or we want to wait till the panel, but.
Brady?
Yeah, so this is a question, clarifying question from the webinar. Someone asked, why were the triggers inside the EEZ for 2018 and 19 different?
I'm sorry,
Why were the triggers inside the EEZ for 2018 and 2019 different?
Why were the triggers?
Yeah. Or maybe it's for the SEZ, but for the closure. Oh, SEZ closure, yeah.
The trigger is the same. It's 2 interactions within the EEZ or 10 outside. However, the implications of having it triggered 2 years in a row are different. And that was just the way the plan was designed because it was sort of, I wasn't here in the origination of the plan, but I would say that that was because it was clearly a sort of a red flag that something's going on and we need to take a harder look and deal with the fact that those interactions may be increasing.
Randy Wells?
Thank you. I fully agree that the electronic monitoring could provide some really useful information. What are the status and plans for implementing electronic monitoring?
Well, the agency has been taking a hard look at electronic monitoring and doing its own research, and has recently been working on a policy for electronic monitoring, but it's not required at this point in time. And because we don't have consensus recommendations and this team has not completed that aspect, we haven't moved forward at this time for the longline fishery. But they have implemented, I believe, and again, there's experts in this room that are more informed than me, but I believe there's a number of vessels that do have it, but it's more on a voluntary or research type approach.
Okay, we'll take one question from the public here. Thanks, and identify yourself and appreciate your question.
Okay. My name is Claire Loprinzi. I'm an indigenous cultural traditional midwife. I come from, we go 8 generations. I'm in the kingdom here, but I'm also a citizen of Sicilia. So I see this topic because I work internationally, teaching traditional birth, and we are very connected to the heartbeat and the beat. And I'm listening to this monitoring, and yesterday I heard some things said too, and I just wanted to share some things because I don't see us up on those panels speaking, and I heard someone yesterday talk about they didn't say Aborigines, they said Australians, but the Australians have the ones that I'm communicating with, some of us have a direct connection to them. We hear them speaking. And we don't hear them very much in our waters anymore. So yesterday that was very good to hear the connection of all of it. So if you look at what you're doing to their kino or to their body, that's ours, because they're an ancestral connection to us. They are, the whales, I'm sure you know, their heartbeats go like this. And I don't hear anybody talking about modern heartbeats, because that's the true way of looking to see how, for example, the heartbeat of a whale goes like this. Heartbeat of a, and they've been here 50 million years. Heartbeat of a mono, of the sharks, goes like this. Heartbeat of the dolphins, and they're all Kanaloa, but I'll use you guys' words. But the heartbeat of the Naya goes like this. Now, when they're active, they go like this, and this is a heartbeat of the baby inside the uterus. So yesterday you talked about your medicines that you're giving them, and I wondered, vaccines. So I've studied the vaccines, the effect on babies, and we know that they have their heart rate.
Let me just make sure, I'm not quite sure
You'll
where
get the
we're going
questions.
for false killer whales,
Okay,
so just
yeah,
make
you-
sure
you
we
will.
move
Yeah.
that so we can move along.
Yeah, you will.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if you look at, because they're all connected, they're all mammals, they're all ohana, they're all part of a big family. So when you look at the vaccines that you're giving to a newborn baby, for example, they've now moved the fetal heart rates up another 20. So a heart rate goes like this, but it goes like this. It means stress. So I wondered, in killer whales, in any of the Kanaloa, where are they just being used to study for vaccines? Because have you considered that you're changing their DNA? Because they're made from aborted fetuses? So why in all of your things, and the monitoring that you're doing, this electric monitoring, why don't you just go back to the simple ways that we already have? Because we've run out of time. For example, the whales that you talked about, when they go up to the surface, so if they're going like this, when they go up there for a couple hours before they dive down. When they get hit by sonar, they try to get up right away and they burst their brains. Now, I've been with people's in Crete, that's Crete, off thing. They've already done the studies that you guys are all talking about. They know why their brains are just blowing up. We're losing too many of them. We don't have time. These are our ancestral links, and I want you guys just to really think about that, because that's why we're always here, and we always will be here. And we cannot wait around for more chemical warfare, more tests on all of these things. We need to clean up our oceans. We need to stop the sonar, and I still don't hear anybody talking about military up there. Talk to the commander up there at Pohakaloa. He's a good guy, JR. I'm a friend of his. Talk to them. See what's happening in the oceans.
Okay,
Because that's
thank
the
you.
only way you're going to be able
Right.
to
Thank you very much.
Yeah, don't
Let's-
turn,
we've gotta
no,
move on with the
we're
program.
here. I will stop.
I appreciate your
But-
comments.
Yeah,
So let's
if-
move on with the program.
No, I will leave, and I will finish my comments. But when you do that, mahe iko aloha. You here in Kona, so you know where you came from. You don't do that. We have the right to speak. Okay? And on topic. You guys don't, you're doing this to our ancestors. So you need to remember that. And this is, for us, chemical warfare, it's a violation of who they are. They have been here a lot longer than you guys are young. You're like little babies. We all are compared to them. So just remember that when one of us comes up here, please don't cut us off. And maybe you could think about putting one of us on a panel so that we can really speak and we can help solve these things, because we've already got the answers, because we've got a connection with them. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now I think we've finished with questions for Anne. So we're going to move on to the panel. I guess I'd ask the panelists to come up and Aaron to come back up. And I think you each have your name tags, so I'll let you seat yourselves. Yeah.
Just ask if Trevor Reiner is in the audience,
Oh.
just in case he came.
I don't-
I doubt it. Just ask.
No, Trevor's at C. Trevor's at C, right?
He is still at sea? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Okay, so I want to welcome our panelists for the continuation of the pelagic false killer whale discussion. We have Brendan Cummings, who's the Conservation Director of the Center for Biological Diversity and a member of the Take Reduction team. We have Hannah Bernard, Executive Director and co-founder of the Hawaii Wildlife Fund, also a TRT member. Eric Kingma, Executive Director of the Hawaii Longline Association. I don't know if you're a TRT member. I'm not. Okay. And then Asuka Ishizaki, who's the Protected Species Coordinator for the Western Pacific Management Council. And I think I'd like to let each one of you give a little introduction and a few thoughts on not only what you've heard from Aaron and Ann, but you're members of the Take Reduction team, and I attended that meeting last April, and it's really a dedicated group. I mean, this is a group that talks intensely, that works intensely on some of the issues that have been brought up to mitigate this problem. And so I really, and I also acknowledge that you're in the middle of the process, right? This team is still working and still trying to solve. There have been a few hiccups, right? Because we had to close the SEZ. There have been things that maybe disrupted progress, made questions come up, but so I'd like to sort of make this very constructive, sort of where are we, how are we working through this kind of discussion, recognizing you're in the middle of the process and how can we move that process forward. So I've got a list. I'm going to start with Brendan, Hannah, Asuka, and then Eric. Just, a minute or two on your perspectives. Thank you.
Good morning. About 15 years ago, my organization sued NIMS to force them to convene a take reduction team, and as punishment for that, they appointed me to it. And for the past decade, we've been struggling with this. But fundamentally, I think the framework the team came up with of gear and hooks that are strong enough to catch tuna, but weak enough that when properly tensioned, false killer whales can get away, can and should work. The problem is that the actual plan, as recommended by the team in 2010, never actually was implemented. The team came up with recommendations for doing an experiment to demonstrate if a weaker hook, a 4.0 hook, could be implemented without impacting catch of the fishery. And according to the criteria set out by the team, which included fishermen and Westpac, those criteria were met. NIMS proposed that as a regulation, but for various reasons, the final regulation imposed a 4.5 millimeter hook, which was really a status quo hook for much of the fishery. And the fact that this plan didn't really work was largely masked by the fact that in the interim, at the same time, new abundance estimates increased the abundance such that take, instead of being consistently above PBR, hovered a little bit below PBR. And there was a sense that the plan must be working because we're now below PBR. But in fact, actual reduction in serious injury and mortality rate from hookings didn't go down. And it's taken a decade for everyone to kind of collectively realize that and grapple with that. And I think we're now at a point where there's a consensus that we need to move to a weaker hook. The sticking point is, how do we actually get there? What processes need to happen and what goes with it? What may get traded off? What may get added? And so I'll leave it at that. Hand it off to Hannah.
Thank you, Brendan. My name is Hannah Bernard. I'm with Hawaii Wildlife Fund, and I also have experience on the Pacific Offshore Cetacean Take Reduction Team, which was a team that was formed to reduce the bycatch of marine mammals in the driftgill net fleet off California, Oregon, and Washington. Did achieve consensus and did achieve the goals of their plan. So I have had success with this process, and it is fairly inclusive. To the point of our former speaker, it includes the stakeholder groups pretty widely. And so this has been an organic process of us coming together and talking and reaching consensus originally, and having challenges with where we go from here because the plan's not working. What I liked hearing Anne mention was the importance of our recommendation, excuse me, going forward with electronic monitoring. So to the extent that the gear recommendations that have been made, whether we reach consensus as a group or not, gear recommendations, gear changes need to be made to this fishery. There isn't any question about that. But those recommendations for gear changes and gear handling are only as effective as how they're implemented. So without the proper training, which we've reiterated over and over again, we've identified serious gaps in the training issue with the crew not receiving the appropriate training. If you don't have the right training, and then some sort of setup to evaluate the efficacy that shows how the crew is operating. We know from observed sets that it's not being handled properly. So if we don't have observers on most of the fleet, we can assume that it's not being handled properly. Or maybe it is, but we need that information, and that's why we really strongly believe that we need to have electronic monitoring. And the team has not completely agreed yet on when that would be best implemented, but it needs to be soon, in some of our opinion. So we're trying to hone in on that date and time. And in addition, there's one more issue that we haven't touched on yet in this forum, but that is equally important, and that is the concern that with the closure of the SEZ, there may be some reconfiguration of gear, and there may be fishing, shortline style, in the SEZ. There may be not longline fishing, but there may be shortline fishing. There may be seasonal fishing changes that are occurring with reconfiguring gear, and there's no way for us to address that. We don't know how much of that is going on, but it could be impacting these species. So that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Asuka?
Hi, good morning. Asuka Ishizaki. I'm the Protected Species Coordinator on staff at the Western Pacific Regional Fishery Management Council. The council's been involved with the false killer whale interaction issue in the Hawaii longline fishery since the early times. The fishery is otherwise managed under the Pelagic Fishery Ecosystem Plan developed by the council and managed under the Magnuson-Stevens Act. Prior to the National Marine Fisheries Service forming the take reduction team, for a number of years after CBD sued on the issue, or until CBD actually sued on the issue, National Marine Fisheries Service had not formed a TRT citing resource constraints. So in that period, starting in 2005, the council formed a Marine Mammal Advisory Committee to look at data gaps where information is needed to get better information to address the issue. Since then, the council has continued to work with the industry to improve the outreach as soon as the take reduction plan was implemented, and we started seeing that captain and crews were not handling the line and not attempting to straighten the hook. Industry and the council worked together to develop a video that the captains were required to view to really emphasize the importance of straightening that hook and making that attempt, and that cutting the line immediately was not the way to really solve the issue. So we've done that, and then we've also, another thing that we worked with the industry was to really try to find a way to avoid depredation, recognizing that until, as Erin mentioned earlier, until we can really address the depredation issue, we're not really going to address the interaction issue. And so we did a project to look at a device that would trigger on catch and protect the catch to prevent catch depredation. So we did that a couple of years. There's some operational challenges to implementing a solution like that, but we did look into it and at least do some trials on that. So we continue to be engaged in the false killer whale interaction issues. One thing I did want to point out up front is one of the issues that the Council in its Scientific and Statistical Committee has raised over time is how the serious injury determination is made and the criteria upon which interactions are determined as serious injury. As there was questions earlier about most of the interactions actually resulting in the animal being released alive, but because of the hook in the mouth or any gear remaining on the animal, for the most part around the head area, is considered serious injury. That criteria is a National Marine Fisheries Service policy. It is not a regulation, it's not a requirement under the MMPA, the statute itself, but it's an agency policy. So the Council's SSC, Scientific and Statistical Committee, has over time raised some concerns with essentially any of those mouth hookings treated essentially equal to a death. It's counted as one equal to a one mortality. Whereas common sense would, indicate that if you can remove as much of the trailing gear as possible, you eliminate the potential of entanglement as a result of gear remaining, and that should, in turn, contribute to improved post-hooking survival. But because of the way that the policy is currently written, there is no incentive for the crew to remove that gear. So most recently at the March SSC meeting, they made a recommendation to, or requested to the agency to look at ways to get information, the scientific information, to be able to inform a probability-based serious injury mortality criteria, which is something that's done for some of the large cetacean as well as sea turtles for interactions in the longline fishery. So I just wanted to mention that as something that in the larger context of things, as we continue to figure out how to minimize impacts to false killer whales, that really needs to be part of the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Eric?
Aloha mai kako. Eric Kingma, Executive Director of the Hawaii Longline Association. Thanks for having me here to participate. It's great to be in Keauhou. Thanks for the audience for coming out to listen, and commissioners and advisors. It's my first time attending a Marine Mammal Commission meeting, and it's neat to see the level of interest. The Hawaii longline fishery is what we believe one of the most important fisheries of the United States. And for Hawaii, it is critically important to our food security. It's the #1 food producing industry in the state of Hawaii. There's about 145 vessels that operate in the fishery, and nearly all land in Honolulu. Aaron Olson's presentation earlier, to me, struck me as something really interesting in respect to the level of oversight and monitoring in our fishery, which is essentially unparalleled in comparison to foreign fleets. And so we have an opportunity from an industry perspective as well as scientists and managers to get it right because of the level of involvement, not only cooperation from industry, but level of involvement from the National Marine Fisheries Service and others monitoring, Coast Guard, et cetera. So there is so much interest and involvement in this fishery that we have an opportunity to make changes, to implement mitigation measures that can be transferred to foreign fleets that are having much higher impacts on these populations than our fishery. There was a question about the level of effort outside and international waters on the high seas adjacent to the Hawaii archipelago. You can look right now on your computers, on your mobile device, and see hundreds of vessels on Global Fishing Watch reporting through AIS, ringing the EEZ around Hawaii. The Hawaii longline fishery now fishes over 70% of its effort in the high seas. With the SEZ closure and the Marine National Monument prohibitions, today there's only 17% of U.S. waters around the U.S. waters on the Hawaiian archipelago that are open to the Hawaii longline fleet. 17%. So the fishery has been forced to fish on the high seas. Nearby Johnston Atoll, I saw that it was one of the criteria for removing the SEC closure. Well, that was closed fully to the full extent in 2014 to all commercial fishing. I'll just wrap up. The last point I want to make is that the Hawaii longline fishery, represented by captains in the TRT, advisors, and maybe I'll be on the TRT one day. I look forward to that. We've been active in participating in this process since the beginning, and we look forward to continue to participate. With respect to these recommendations, it's been a year now, I believe, in forming these, which is it's a bit frustrating. It's been a slow process, but I think we're getting there, as I understand it. And with respect to the recommendations on the 4.2, we understand that there was an initiative to get the necessary research done as part of the package, and the proposal wasn't necessarily let in time, so it's a bit frustrating that the Fisheries Service couldn't complete that process so we get the underlying information. So they're going to have to wait another year to do that. With respect to the 2.3 diameter branch line, we understand that suppliers to the fleet locally in Hawaii and Honolulu have already been engaging producers or manufacturers of this line and are looking to procure it now. So they want to supply the fleet with these stronger branch lines. The modifications to the SEZ we think are very, very important. We think the punitive, just blanket closures are not necessarily reflective of the issue and hasn't really worked, so we need to look at that. Electronic monitoring is something I worked on in my previous life, and it is, as many believe, is sort of a panacea to things, but it does take a lot of time and resources, both on the front end and on the back end, to implement. And the Hawaii longline fishery has been involved in pilot projects with EM since 2010, and currently there are 17 vessels with camera systems on board. And so we're definitely not opposed to EM, it's just a lot of resources needed to get it right. So I'll just conclude there and look forward to any questions from the audience or panel. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks you all for the really good introductions, filling out the perspective on the TRT. So I'm going to go straight to the commissioners, scientific advisors for questions. And I'll remind you, put your flag up so that I can see it with my nearsighted perspective. So Randy Reeves.
Yes, it seems like there are lots of serious issues to bore into here. And one thing I would like to hear more from Asuka about, if I understand it correctly, the group that you work with is tending to encourage more tolerance, in fact, encouragement of line cutting, and as a preferable approach to trying to get the hook to straighten or to get the whales off another way. And you were proposing a probabilistic approach to serious injury determinations. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, how it would be tested? For example, what your data are for determining what the effect of cut lines is on the whales? I mean, I assume there's some ground truth data on that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think we're all at a point where the lack of data is the issue. And I think with false killer whales, the inability to, and the difficulty of tagging false killer whales post-hooking has been kind of a hindering factor in moving towards something like a probabilistic serious injury determination criteria. So one of the things that the council is really wanting to see is more research and creative ways of doing research so that we get better information on differential probabilities of false killer whale survival depending on the amount of gear remaining. Because right now it's mostly a kind of a 0 and 1 kind of situation. So we do not have additional data for that. What we're really pushing for right now and wanting to see is more research focusing on that and how do we, more discussion on how do we get there. Recognizing that tagging them alongside the vessel after an interaction is very challenging. One of the things that I had some discussions with Aude Puccini, I believe she's going to be here later today, but was thinking creatively outside of the box about how do we understand gear interaction with the animal, the physiology of the animal itself. And so if you had a hook in the mouth and if you had a line attached to it and if you tried to pull on that gear, how does that interact with the animal's the anatomy of the animal and how do they, is that actually better than leaving a hook in the mouth? And so one of the things that we were looking into was doing what's called a finite element modeling. It's a modeling approach that's used in engineering and mathematics, basically recreating an animal's head, a model, a computer model, and then to be able to simulate how, if a gear is actually inside the mouth, and if you try to pull it, if you were able to, rather than doing that, leave it in there, do some sort of simulation to try to get at a better understanding of what that gear does to the animal. I think that's where we're at and really wanting to see more of that. And I think what we hear from fishermen is that, what they see is they pulled up, marlin or sharks that have, hooks in the mouth and, have survived well after an interaction, and well recognizing that, sharks and marine mammals are very different. But from their experience, they feel that removal of that trailing gear is beneficial, and right now there's no incentive. So that's kind of where we're coming from on that issue.
Okay, is there anyone on this actual specific issue? Just checking. Francis, go ahead.
Thank you, and I think it might be a question for you and then maybe also for Eric, but so my background is I'm a veterinarian and I attended both of the NIMS workshops years ago to develop serious injury criteria, but as my experiences with pinnipeds, I was in the pinniped group. And what came out of the second workshop was that and this is my memory, so I don't quote me on this completely, but I remember there was a dichotomy in sort of the collective wisdom on the impact of leaving a hook in the mouth of a monk seal versus a cetacean. And the reason for that was really because of there was so much more data of actual observations of seals because they hole out on beaches. So we could basically, as veterinarians, we could say, we know that, X, Y, and Z happens. And some of those were concerns about, infection, about damage to tissues, and then how the animal would deal with trailing line, etc. And in the cetacean group, there was really this lack of data. It was like, well, we have to operate from a precautionary principle, and so, the criteria were developed, and here we are. So I guess my question is has there been an effort to really try and think about how we can get more data, more observations from stranded animals, from carcasses, of really looking at those injuries? And the research that I'm aware of has been on the mechanics of putting large weights on hooks and pulling them is distinct from really looking at what are the wounds, what are there old animals that wash up dead that have numerous teeth removed and clearly, coped with it. So partly that, other ways to get more information of how they do cope with hooks and injuries. And then secondly, from the NIMS perspective, it's been a while since those criteria were developed and there were 2 successive. Is there any interest in re-examining the criteria to focus more specifically on this species and this gear?
Maybe go to Aaron, or you?
Yeah. Okay, so on the, your question about, various other ways of collecting data and using carcasses. So there was, the regional office did fund a study a few years back with Bill McClellan using stranded short-fin pilot whales and false killer whales on the East Coast. And as part of that study, provided hooks that are common from the Hawaii longline fleet. I believe there was only 1 false killer whale in the study just because of lack of carcasses available. But he did test a number of pilot whales, and the resulting outcomes of that varied from just broken teeth but no significant damage to the jaw to broken jaws. But the sample size wasn't really sufficient to be able to draw conclusions about developing probabilistic criteria at this point. I don't know if any of the other TRT members have any insight, feelings about that study, but at this point there just wasn't enough. I was not part of either of those serious injury evaluations. They were before my time in the agency, but what we draw upon quite a lot is Randy's bottlenose dolphin data from Sarasota with hooked animals, the long-term prognosis of bottlenose dolphins with hooks, and maybe that's what Andy was going to talk about. Now he's putting his card down. And that's still, for us, the best available data from which to evaluate prognosis of an animal hooked in the mouth or that has ingested a hook. So to the second part, NIMS is just now beginning, after long delay, reevaluating serious injury determination criteria through a national working group. And we've collectively identified a number of specific issues with the existing criteria that need further discussion. This concept of developing probabilistic injury outcomes is common among all of the TRTs and a number of different situations, and so it is something that we're going to be discussing. The probability-based criteria for large whales are based on known outcomes of animals, that there was some intervention or something happened and we know what happened to the whale, and we just don't have that for false killer whales or really for any of the other small cetaceans. So that's the status on that.
Yeah, Azuka.
Yeah, I'll just mention that there was a false killer whale, an insular animal, I believe, but nonetheless a false killer whale that stranded on the Big Island several years back that had 5 hooks in its stomach, and the hooks were not the cause of the death. We don't know what circumstance that animal went through to end up with 5 hooks in the mouth. They could have just easily eaten an ulua or something that was already had a hook in its mouth and ingested. We don't know, but that is one piece of evidence that is available.
Eric? Oh, I'm sorry, Hannah.
I'd just like to expand the conversation here to include impacts of repeated interactions and stress, separations of dependent calves and mothers, and social groups. And none of this is being taken into consideration. We're just looking at the serious injury from a hooking. That is just a very small piece of the stress or the problems that the animals can be dealing with, and those are not factored in.
Thanks. Just a comment along the lines of serious injury determinations. I think this is an issue that really does need to be visited in depth and soon. There's a lot of fishermen on the water that don't believe leaving a hook in an animal's mouth is going to lead to mortality in a space on their on the water experience. HLA, Hawaii Longline Association, we're sort of stuck because we're also dealing with a lot of other mitigation measures and issues to deal with, turtles, for example. We are now funding a line cutter device. And the line cutter device, the objective is to remove all the line from the animal. It won't cut through the hook, but it will get through the line. And we want to do this for turtles, for sharks, and then we run into false killer whales, and we have the guidelines that say straighten the hook. And so it comes down to the issue, what's best for the animal? And Anthony in the back, the speaker said about, stressing the animal and the heartbeat, and that's important. And we want to make sure that we're doing the best for the animal. Is it to straighten the hook, or is it to remove the line? And so we need to grapple with that and understand what is best for the animal. So just to reiterate, we do think revisiting the serious injury determination is important, and we want to work on that soon. Thanks.
Okay. Well, Francis, you have one tiny thing to say, but then Brendan and Azuka. I'm not sure how long to go with the mortality and
This is really
serious
tiny, I can
injury
ask it,
before
but-
moving on to other issues, but go ahead, Francis.
Just a tiny. Has the question of materials, as distinct from shape, been discussed? The material of the hook. There's been a lot of discussion in the tagging world on materials that are more compatible, less likely to result in infection, blah, blah, blah. So I know there's been strength and shape, but I was just curious if materials had ever come up.
Brendan had his hand up first. Let me go to you, Brendan. And then,
Not specifically. Is that on?
yeah.
Not specifically on that question of the material, although I believe the regs require stainless. Part of the issue here, and I think this faces any TRT, is the problem with these whales is, as Aaron pointed out, they're smarter than us, and we're not going to be able to keep them away from the boats or the tuna. And so the only thing we can do is reduce the odds of them getting hooked, or reduce the odds of them getting injured or killed if they are hooked. And that's a mix. To get to that point, that's largely a question of what is the hook. And the good thing about the rule of a decade ago is it shifted to circle hooks throughout, which there were some J hooks in the fleet, and the general, I won't quite say consensus, but the general view is that that's better and reduces the likelihood of hooking, and also increases the likelihood of straightening without injury. But I said sort of the problem of looking for all sorts of alternative avenues in some level to me feels premature, because we have a hook that there's consensus among the team and everyone looking at it is too strong to be straightened out by most false killer whales. Maybe the biggest ones can do it, but too strong to be straightened out when tension's applied for most whales that get hooked, which results in either the line breaking or the line getting cut. And until we actually try a hook in the fleet that can be straightened by the whale, it feels a little premature to declare that method failed. And the other thing is the TRT is not the group to rewrite the serious injury criteria. Those have been developed by a whole panel of experts, and to the degree on the team we had input from people who were involved in that, notwithstanding statements of the council or the fleet, the operating principle was if you can get the hook out of the animal's mouth without major injury and eliminate the trailing line, that's a far better outcome than leaving it hooked there.
Okay, Asuka, let's try to move to the next subject after your last words, unless Randy's, we're going to get, no, I'm going to have Randy give the last word after you, Asuka, because you've had your hand.
Yeah, I think the council certainly has not abandoned the weak hook idea, and I think is in support of trying some more trials and trying to get to a better hook. I think the issue is that the weak hook is not a self-straightening hook. It does require some handling from the crew, in that handling, guidance of pulling on the line to create tension on the line in order to release the animal is counterintuitive to pretty much all other animals that they're required to release, sharks, turtles, whatnot. And considering that these are really rare interactions, most of these vessels probably have not had a whole lot of interaction experience with a false killer whale. So they are not really going to get a whole lot of experience, being able to do that, straightening the hook. But I think that's where the council is also in support of doing the outreach and really getting that message across. Give it a try, do what you can, straighten that hook. But with that said, I think looking down the line, if we do, need alternative ways of minimizing impacts, I think the line cutter alternative is a good one, and it helps in terms of creating consistency in guidance for all different types of animals that the fleet has to release. And the more consistency you have, the more experience they get, the easier it becomes for them to release and get really good at removing line, removing gear. So that's where I think, part of the reason the council is coming from in thinking about getting to a conversation where we can talk about removal of trailing gear as a good alternative to removing the hook. That's where we're coming from, even just from a human behavior standpoint. How do we get people to do what you want them to do, make it simple for them? So.
Okay. Mike, I want to make sure yours isn't on this issue. Thanks. So we'll bear with Randy for one last word.
Okay. I'm curious from a behavioral perspective. These animals feed differently than many small odontocetes. Many small odontocetes eat their prey whole. They swallow them down. These animals do a lot more manipulation of much larger prey relative to their mouth size. Leaving gear in the mouth that is constantly irritating or injuring every time they're trying to capture a prey item is something that could interfere with their ability to ingest sufficient prey to survive, or just be a constant irritation. And I don't know whether anyone has looked into this aspect of the gear remaining in their mouths.
Okay. We'll be expecting word from Robin on that at some point, but maybe not yet. So Mike Tillman.
Yeah, moving on to a completely different issue. I'm very pleased to hear the good faith efforts underway to try to address the domestic issues. But what troubles me is that there is this foreign fleet element to this that Randy has pointed out. So I was wondering amongst panel members whether there any idea of the magnitude of the foreign fleet takes or of measures to address these issues, say under the Western Pacific Fisheries Agreement. And one of the also perhaps amongst Westpac or the regional office or HLA, they might have some experiences in these matters, and it'd be nice to hear about those. And just remind you all that there is these new importation rules under the MMPA, which are intended to level the playing field on these imports. Thank you.
So comments on the foreign fleet magnitude, impact, and yes, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thanks for that question. The foreign fleets are orders of magnitude higher in terms of effort and numbers of vessels than Hawaii. So I think, as Aaron mentioned, the levels of interactions are greater than the Hawaii fishery, as those vessels are fishing right outside of Hawaii waters. I spent a lot of time in my the job I had before in international committee or commission meetings, namely WCPFC, which is the Western and Central Pacific, and then the IATTC, which is the Eastern Pacific. To my knowledge, false killer whales has never even been mentioned in those commissions. The only marine mammal sort of mitigation and measures that have been implemented have to do with purse seine fishing and not setting on marine mammals in a purse seine net. So really, false killer whales, blackfish, odontocetes issues are not being addressed at all. That doesn't mean that won't be in the future, and that's why I go back to my earlier comment that the future will come a day that hopefully these international commissions will adopt marine mammal mitigation measures, and Hawaii will lead the way, like it has led the way in the shallow set fishery in implementing large circle hooks and mackerel bait. In terms of, as well as other mitigation measures in other fisheries. In terms of observer coverage, foreign fleets in both commissions, East and West, are subject to a 5% observer coverage only. And many of those fleets don't even reach that at all. So Hawaii, as was already mentioned, is 20%. That's the standard. I think last year was 22, almost 25%. And then for the shallow set fisheries, 100%. So no other fleet is even close to the level of monitoring. So we need to catch them up in that regard, and then we need to catch them up in terms of mitigation. So as an industry spokesman, and we want to level the playing field. The import measures could do that, but then it takes monitoring and enforcement of those measures. You have to have the information in order to impose those sanctions and stuff. So that piece is missing, the level of monitoring and implementation of mitigation measures, which I don't think is currently available. Thanks.
Thanks. Well, you okay if Brendan goes first?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, on that point, on the MMPA import measures, finally, half a century after they were written into the law, in a couple of years, the regulations will go into force, requiring foreign caught fish to meet U.S. standards for marine mammal bycatch. And so part of the importance of getting our take reduction plans actually meaningful and effective, and ideally simple and exportable, is that if we do it, if we can show that a certain gear modification has a meaningful reduction in marine mammal bycatch, that then can become the standard of whether foreign caught tuna can come into the United States. And we're already seeing in the run-up for these new import restrictions, certain countries increasing their survey data for marine mammals and doing other things in anticipation of it. So I think this actually is the biggest opportunity to internationalize the impact. But it won't have any impact if our own longline fisheries are catching marine mammals at unsustainable levels and not doing the best we can.
Interesting. Yeah. Ann, is that what you were going to say? Perfect. Okay, I've got Randy, and I assume Dennis is going to put his flag up at some point. Go ahead, Randy, sorry.
Eric can probably answer this easily, because I noticed you said earlier that the longline fishery in Hawaii is important to U.S. food security, and the economics or the dynamics of the foreign fleets that are fishing with long lines that might involve false killer whales, are they exporting to the U.S.? And is the U.S. fishery exporting elsewhere? Or is it all going to the domestic market?
Yeah, the Hawaii longline fishery principally supplies Hawaii markets and the U.S. mainland. 1% to 2% may go to foreign sources. So most of the fish are staying in Hawaii, with around 20% to the U.S. mainland. The U.S. seafood market is wide open. There are thousands of tons of seafood imported into the United States daily with very little oversight. Recently, there's that seafood import monitoring program implemented by the Fisheries Service and other federal agencies. It's only, I believe, applicable to 17 species of fish and crustaceans. So the point is, the Hawaii fishery is supplying Hawaii and the U.S. mainland, but really there is very little to stop any foreign fishery from importing into the United States. And over 90% of seafood consumed in the United States is from foreign imports. It's less in Hawaii because of the Hawaii longline fishery and local fisheries around here. I think around 60% of the fish consumed in Hawaii is from foreign imports. So just getting back to the point, we believe the Hawaii fishery is very important here locally, not only for local residents, but for our economy, tourist economy. And, we do believe that the level of impact currently on the pelagic population is low. We look forward to the new abundance estimate and examining that with regards to PBR, as well as the 10% criteria.
Okay. So I want to, before I move on to the folks waiting, I want to ask a more pointed question about the TRT process. We have this group of recommendations under consideration. I mean, what's the time frame? And I guess I'd ask you, Ann, when would you actually pull the plug and say, all right, you guys have not finalized this, we need to take action? Where are we in that? We've been a year since the last meeting. I know everyone's working in good faith. I hear it from Dennis, who participates in the team, monthly, that things are moving. But at some point, is it just going to be like, all right, we're going to act?
Thanks for asking that question. I am certain and have been asked that question by several of the TRT members themselves, and I'll answer that in a couple ways. One, I guess it was about November, December of last year that this team was making considerable progress, and we really thought we were very, very close to consensus recommendations. And then we ended up with a government shutdown, which for NIMS definitely put things behind schedule. And of course the additional takes, the takes that occurred in the SEZ, I think and the closure of the SEZ did probably change the tenor of the discussions within the team to some degree. But NIMS has already started to take some of these recommendations independent. We would much prefer to have a consensus recommendation package from the team, but as Eric mentioned, we independently moved forward with contracting a research study. I would argue it's not late. It was never a recommendation that was formalized, but we moved forward and allocated funds for that to take a look at the new gear configuration and run some trials with some vessels. And while our execution of that contract was delayed because of the government shutdown, it's still moving forward without the final recommendation. So NIMS has put a lot of money towards that, and that will be starting soon. That contract has been executed. Also internally, we're talking about the handling and training, which seems like a fairly easy thing to overcome. I mean, it was not without its complexity due to language barriers and also the ability to reach all the people that need to be reached for training, but we are talking about how to revamp our training so that we can do a better job to reach the crew and not just the captains. So those are some important things that have been already going on. As far as actually saying, okay, enough is enough, we're going to move forward, I don't think we've actually firmly decided when that is. We still have hope that this team is going to come together with a final recommendation, but I agree with your concern and a concern I've heard from others that there may be a time very soon that we need to make that decision.
Okay, great. I'm recognizing that we've got two people standing who want to talk. We have coffee break, so recognizing that you're between us and coffee, I'll call on you first and you again. Thanks again and we will have another session focused on odontocetes, so some of that we'll have that chance again, but please go.
Yeah, aloha, ke aloha pishoda. I'm here on behalf of Kaipalawa and also a member of Kia'i Kanaloa, but I'm also a member of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs Cultural Working Group, who participated in creating the expansion of the Papahana Mokuakea boundaries. I just wanted to say a couple things and ask a few questions of Eric, and ask that this body consider some recommendations. The first thing I want to say is to acknowledge the precautionary principle that you brought up earlier, that one of the legal requirements of the precautionary principle is in the absence of conclusive evidence to the contrary, the agency acts in the interest of the protection, right? So the second part to that is that the public trust doctrine, which is a strong legal tenet that we have here in Hawaii, we'd like to recommend that both the precautionary principle and the public trust doctrine be included in the considerations and the evaluation here. With the long line questions I have are, because the kanaloas are all of the bycatch. Those are all of the bodily forms of the god of the sea, Kanaloa. Okay, so whether it's the mano, the shark, the hahalua, the manta ray, the Kanaloa, the false killer whale, dolphins, so on and so forth. Those are actually impacting our inshore, right? Because, and this is my question to you, the 8 main Hawaiian islands are still a part of the long line area of impact, right? It's not? And how long are the lines, the longest and shortest long line do you have? And, and does this body also, are you delivering the bycatch information to them? And so those are the recommendations that we would like to see, because it's still our waters, yeah. It's still, even under the kingdom jurisdiction, it's our waters. And those are affecting our traditional practices inside as well, because they're making a wall around where the animals go in and out, and they're getting whacked in this, and this is our concern. So, thank you.
Okay, and I also realized I misread the time. We've already gone 15 minutes into the coffee break, so I'm going to have you, and just quickly, and then we'll move on. And there will be more opportunities to talk, both after the next session and during the coming, so go.
I'll make mine quick. My name is Mark Hughes. I teach marine conservation to a lot of the high school students in the area, and I spend a lot of time out on the water, on the boats, in the pelagic areas. I've been out here about 25 years doing that. And my question and comments are for Brendan, Hannah, and Eric. I've been listening to you talk about EM, electronic monitoring. I also heard Eric mention that they were cooperating with the panel and the group to try to make sure that there was the least amount of bycatch as possible. I know from a fact that a lot of the people that work on the fishing boats are not English speaking. Many of them are Indonesians. And I speak Indonesian. I spent a lot of time in Indonesia. And I've been on fishing boats out there. And there is a problem trying to get the data to make bycatch limits when you can't trust the data. So I think Brendan brought it up about the electronic monitoring, or maybe it was Hannah. But I strongly believe that you went, if you're going to set the data limits, you need to be able to trust the data. You're going to set the bycatch limits, you need to trust the data. In order to do that, you need as much transparency as possible. And in your conversation, Eric, you said you went from cooperating fully to not opposing towards the end. And that wording scares me, because I think there needs to be as much transparency as possible in that regard.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. And we're going to leave it at that. And Daryl?
We will go ahead and extend
the coffee break into 10:55, so we'll take an extra 10 minutes.
Okay,
We'll cut it
yeah.
off our
Thanks
lunch
for your,
break.
yeah, thanks for your patience and for my going long by mistake. And thanks to the panelists and the speakers. We really appreciate it.